Hi, I'm Joe Sommer. I served 4 years in the Orlick, which may or may not be a record for commissioned officer service. I went aboard an ensign and came off a lieutenant 4 years later. Initially joined the Orlick in June of 1958 in Yokosuka, Japan. And we got underway that evening after I'd reported into the exec and he'd given me a stateroom. He said, "We're going to refuel tonight in Sagami-wan, go back to the after fueling station and observe what's going on." So I went back there, and the engineer in charge of the fueling station had this green ensign there. He says, "Get up and director 45 out of the way." So I did. It was nighttime, and there was whistles blowing and lights bobbing. I didn't have a clue as to what was going on, of course, and lots of commands being shouted. And eventually, they got a wire and a hose across from the oiler and started pumping oil. And about 15 minutes into the evolution, I heard the international danger signal, which I remembered from my midshipman days of training in rules of the road, and I thought that's not a good signal. And noticed we were getting very, very close to the oiler, and very shortly thereafter we bumped the oiler, not hard, but definitely bumped her in the port quarter of Orlick and then separated. And I don't know to this day whether the problem was in the Orlick or whether it was with the oiler as far as steering was concerned, but I thought, this is an interesting omen. You know, I've now been at sea as a commissioned ensign all of 6 hours and been in my first collision, and I didn't think that was too good a start. But at any rate, it got better after that. Initially, they made me the first lieutenant, which was typical for the boot ensign, and then I, shortly thereafter, was sent to the ASW officer school in Point Loma. And when I came back, took over as ASW officer and Fox Division officer. I was really, really fortunate because I had 3 great mentors there. The fellow who was a gunnery officer at the time was a fellow by the name of Leroy Short. He was a Mustang JG, who was former chief fire controlman on the battleship Wisconsin. And Roy told me whatever I know about naval ordnance and gunnery, and I was ably assisted by 2 of the best chiefs I think you'd ever have, a chief fire controlman Blue and chief gunner's mate Laffey. And I learned early on the old adage is quite true, and that is if you want your division or your department to run well, why trust your chiefs and tell them what you want done, and it happens. I also believe the old adage that if the Navy wanted an ensign to have a wife, they would have issued one, so I waited till about a month after I made JG, which in those days was 18 months, and then married a young lady who was the sister of my then roommate, the ship's DCA, Fred Leonard, and we've now been married for 56 happy, more or less, years. But right after we got back from our honeymoon, with absolutely no advance notification, we learned that the ship's home port was being shifted to Yokosuka, Japan. And at the time, my new bride was making roughly double the amount of money I was and working half the hours. And I thought, gee, I'm not sure she's want to go to Japan. Well, fortunately, she did. And so I extended a year to take her with me. And of course, I went out by ship. She came by air later. But we had a wonderful time for the 2 years home ported at Yokosuka. The few times that we were actually in Yokosuka. One of the theories was that this Destroyer 3, we were the first post-war destroyer squadron in Japan, was going to operate primarily with the Northern Carrier Group, ergo that's why they put us in Yokosuka. Well, in a typical perverse Navy scheduling manner, it seemed somehow that we always ended up down in the South China Sea operating out of Subic Bay, and all the ships that came out from Long Beach or San Diego drew the Northern Group. So I didn't really get to Japan as much as I would have liked at that time. But one of the highlights that I remember while we were there was the ship was going to go down to Hong Kong for a 1-week visit with the entire division. And so Miriam, my wife, made reservations by air, and we had a hotel room booked in Kowloon, and I had leave granted and whatever. And sure enough, 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave for Hong Kong, something hit our sonar dome. We didn't know to this day, you know, what it was, but we had to go and dry dock at Yokosuka to get it fixed. And make a long story short, we spent a week in and out of dry dock every day. It got to the point where we were moving the ship in and out with the duty section while they tried to figure out how to fix the sonar dome. Once they finally got it fixed, of course, the division was long gone, headed for Japan, or headed for Hong Kong. And our captain obviously knew somebody in high places and got permission for excess SOA. And we went down there at speeds of 24 to 27 knots, which normally the transit speed would have been 16 knots, and even arranged to have an oiler pick us up off Okinawa to top us off. And so I arrived in Hong Kong coincident with an approaching typhoon. Naturally, that always happens for good Liberty ports. And when we pulled into the buoys there at the piers at Wanchai, signal was up for the captains of the arriving ships to go over to the SOPA on the other ship. They all came back with long faces. They said, we're going to sortie immediately because of this typhoon coming up. And I thought, oh boy, you know, just my luck. And of course the exec and the captain both knew they granted me leave. And the XO looked at me and he said, Mr. Sommer, he said, can you be off the ship in 30 minutes? I said, XO, I can be off this thing in 5 minutes flat. And fortunately, they very kindly gave me the gig and ran me over to Kowloon. And so I had the privilege of standing on the pier in Kowloon, watching the ship sortie. And as usual, it took 4 to 5 days for them to find the typhoon and run through it. In the meantime, it rained real hard that night in Hong Kong, and the Star ferries never quit running, and we had a grand time. Just Miriam and I, we had the town to ourselves for a week. Then other things worthy of note. Typhoons, yeah, it seems to have spent our life in typhoons. I remember one particular one. It was really kind of scary. We were in the Taiwan Straits and couldn't leave our patrol station and knew we were going to get run over by at least the edges of a pretty good typhoon. And that's exactly what happened. It was strong enough, it ripped the motor whaleboat right out of its davits and we lost it. It took the ship's post office, which was an aluminum deckhouse projection on the port side, ripped that open so we had water fore and aft in the interior passageway that serves the various crew compartments and the engine rooms. Took Mount 51, moved it about 4 inches back in its base ring, flooded the chief's quarters, flooded forward officers' country. We lost steering briefly and had to steer with engines, and it was the scariest time I think I spent in the entire 4 years in the ship. Fortunately, they did get us a trip to Yokosuka and about a month to put it all back together again after that. About roughly 2-year point in my career aboard, when you came through ROTC, they commissioned, if you were on the scholarship program, which I was, you were commissioned in the regular Navy, but you had to request retention if you wanted to continue the regular Navy. And at that point, I was on my second of what proved to be 3 captains, and the second one was a bit of a disappointment. And I got a little bit fed up, and I said, this is it, you know, I'm out of here, I'm going to go back and get my master's and teach history. So I reverted to USNR, and then we got a new CO about 6 months later, and it was just the difference between night and day as far as I was concerned. So I went to the new CO and bended knee and said, any chance of augmenting back? And in the meantime, I'd become USNR. So I was USN, USNR, and then back to USN. And finished out my time there. The rest of my time on Orleck was just doing the usual things that a department head does as a gunnery officer. I can't think of any. We did one gunfire support mission for an Operation Tulungan, which was a CETO amphibious exercise down in the Philippines. Remember that particularly. And I was due to get off actually in June of '58, and at the 11th hour, the Red Chinese, as we called them in those days, did something that stirred up the government, and so they decided to have a show of force, and they sent an amphibious transport and a landing ship dock and us. That was the show of force. 1 destroyer, 1 LSD, 1 amphibious transport, up to sort of basically make holes in the ocean just south of Hainan Island in the Tonkin Gulf to see if we could provoke any reaction, which we did. Well, of course, the reaction it provoked was we weren't getting into port, and I wasn't getting off the ship when I was supposed to, so I ended up doing about another 3 weeks unexpectedly. In those days, of course, we had no email or whatever. The only way you could communicate with your dependents was through what was called MARS, Military Affiliate Radio Service. It was basically you would find a friendly operator ashore if they had a spare transmitter on the ship and say, can you patch me through by telephone to so-and-so? And they would help. And so I knew that Miriam was moving out. We lived in quarters in Yokohama on a certain date, expecting me back there detached. And so I got word to her, unavoidably detained, and wished her luck. And of course, that's all I could tell her. And eventually worked my way by a fleet oiler and then over to Okinawa on a Space A, up to Yokosuka, and finally got off the ship and linked up with her. And after that, we went on to another 16 years of Navy adventures, and I eventually retired in '79 as a commander.